So this has kind of been a topic that has been on my mind on a weekly basis for maybe a year, more or less, because every single week I'm dealing with some sort of geopolitical thing that's going on, whether it's like memes or maps I'm reviewing. Of course, I do history stuff and like flag stuff, but there's always videos that I'm covering on a weekly basis that is just like from a world perspective of what's going on. And it's very shocking to me. I like to talk about this topic. It's very shocking to me because for my whole life, and more than likely if you're watching this video, you're probably younger than me, but for my entire life, I don't know a world where the US isn't the main dominant power, because after the Cold War, in 1991, when the Soviet Union split up and then obviously a lot of the communist nations began to fall apart, it was pretty much just the US that was running things. And more, it's very clear that that is not the case anymore. And it's been an interesting build-up. And what's happening right now, in my opinion, is really kind of reminds me more of like a geopolitical situation that we'd have to go back more than 100 years to. Because during the Cold War, there was only really two major sides. You could say it's like a third, political side, the non-aligned movement, but it was really just, the US, NATO, the West versus the Soviet bloc, the Warsaw Pact, all that. So, for decades after World War II, it was just those two sides competing. Then the Soviet Union exploded. I was born, and I have only really seen a world where it was pretty much just run by the U.S. And it is now becoming more and more clear, it didn't necessarily start in 2024, but I think it's becoming extremely obvious how we are living in a world where that is not the case anymore. And there are multiple powers, quote-unquote powers, that, things are just a lot more divided. I don't think that you can necessarily say this is a Cold War 2.0 just yet, but especially because this is kind of funny that I'm doing this video all while I have a Bricks plushie in the background. I don't really know how that whole thing is going to play out, but obviously there's a lot more powers, China being one of them. I'm not saying that the US isn't still the world's strongest country, but they are definitely not the overwhelmingly dominant force with just this massive, NATO alliance backed by them anymore. And like I am saying, this is becoming more and more clear. I reviewed a post like last week about G7 countries and their like annual growth rate, like economically, versus more like BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, China, the big ones, India. And obviously their growth rate's going to be bigger because of where they started to where they're going now. But it's just, we're in a very interesting time. It's interesting to be dealing with, like, to have a channel that's focused on these topics, because I feel like this is just a really interesting time to be making YouTube videos about the niche that I make YouTube videos about. Because if I try to do this like maybe 15 years ago, I don't feel like there'd be a whole lot going on. I mean, obviously you had the U.S. and their invasion of, like, the Middle East, the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, but there's just so much going on in the world, specifically after COVID. Like after COVID is really the last 3 years. I don't think I reviewed this map because I thought it was going to get demonetized, but there was a map talking about the recent conflicts that are going on in the world. And we've had, like, this is a smaller one, but you have like a civil war that's apparently still going on in Myanmar. You obviously have the Russian invasion of Ukraine. You have the threat of China invading Taiwan. You have everything going on with Israel and Palestine, and then Iran stepping into that. The Middle East is still very chaotic. I mean, that's probably just one of those constants in the universe that's probably not going to change. Didn't I talk about that recently? Like the conflict in the Middle East is not going to just disappear in the next, like, few decades. That's probably just going to be a permanent thing. I think it's just set up. There's a whole backstory, the borders and everything is just set up to kind of be really messy. But it's interesting to be making these to be in this topic on YouTube, because there's always going to be some interesting things to cover, and I kind of wonder if that's where so much popularity came. I mean, first of all, my channel found a lot of success after Russia invaded Ukraine because the public became way more aware of just geopolitical situations, conflicts that are going on around the world. Specifically in Europe, that was a really, really big deal. Obviously, there were conflicts going on around the world, but seeing Russia mobilize against such a big nation like Ukraine again, and to have the battlefront in Europe again, that really brought a lot of attention, a lot of traffic to these topics. And my channel, that was really when I had a lot of breakout success. And it's just, like I said, I don't think I could have done this 10 years ago, because there was things going on, but mainstream interest in this stuff definitely wasn't there. And ever since the invasion of Ukraine from Russia, now everyone's got their sights set on Taiwan now, because that's supposedly going to happen. And there's more and more reports that it's going to happen soon. It looks like my prediction is going to come true. I predicted in May that China would not invade Taiwan in June. I think we're going to make that, but it's crazy that is even being considered right now. Probably before the election, before a U.S. election, is I think what a lot of people are predicting, that if China was going to do it, then maybe before November, when the U.S. Has our U.S. presidential election. Just last week, the whole Florida submarine thing, the Russian, there's 3. I first read there was only 1 Russian sub. Then maybe I read that there was 3. I didn't look too much into this, so I don't know what's fake news or not. But apparently there was at least 1 Russian sub off the coast of Florida. Possibly they were just passing by Cuba even. So there's really, I don't know if I would describe it as a Cold War 2.0. I've been seeing the word multipolar world pop up again, and that's why I'm saying it's reminding me more. We have to go back 100 years to really see that, to really be familiar with what, throughout most of history, that's kind of how it was. You know what I mean? So maybe we are just going back to that. There's, of course, going to be powers that are, ranked like a first, second, third. But throughout a lot of the 1800s, you have Britain is probably the number 1 power. And then in second, you have a good France, and the U.S. is still climbing the ranking. So right now, I mean, it's just interesting. You have the U.S. and then you have China. And in the background, you have all the demographic issues that's happening with Europe and the U.S. It's not affecting the U.S. quite as much, but definitely Europe is seeing depopulation, and that's something that's obviously been going on in the background. That's going to really affect countries. It's affecting China, of course. It's not affecting India yet. I'm literally pointing to the BRICS ball, but there's that whole aspect of it, changing technology, changing the way warfare works. It's looking more and more I'm hoping that, there could be a conflict resolution that happens with Ukraine and Russia at some point here soon. I don't know what's going to happen with that. But, that's a whole nother aspect of it, because what is Russia going to do next? Obviously, a bunch of new countries just joined NATO because of that Russian invasion. You're talking about Finland. I'm talking about Finland and Sweden. And there's now NATO countries that are increasing their military budgets. Certain NATO countries trying to rely less on U.S. military to build up their own. So is this just a world going back to where it kind of sits normally in history? We're just not used to it. Did we just experience a brief window of time where there was really only 2 sides? I'm talking about the Cold War after World War II, and then after the Cold War ended, there was just one side. Are things now just going back to the way they just kind of normally were? Because this is normally how things work. Anyways, it's just a really interesting topic. It's a little bit scary, but it's interesting that I get to talk about this stuff to so many people online, and obviously there's more and more people that are finding interest in this stuff. I that's what I really like to do, is just to teach people about, the world and aspects like that. But sometimes I can't help if people just don't have an interest in it. Like, I can only pull people into the topics as much as possible. But usually there's events that take place that will grab people's attention and want to learn more. So it's an interesting spot that I'm in to be able to teach people like this. And I feel extremely grateful because I've always liked these topics. I always thought I was weird for liking these topics, but it's just weird. The next, the 2020s are going to be a weird time because of, unfortunately, all the world tension that's kind of going on. So hopefully I will continue to cover this stuff, and hopefully YouTube will not destroy all my channels.